Assalamu alaikum. Hello. This is our second lecture of the course Western Intellectual History. The title of the lecture is A Brief Overview of the Great Masters, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. This is Dr. Maha Sallam, Associate Professor of English Literature, Faculty of Arts, Ain Shams University. First, we need to have a historical background about ancient Greece, the home of the three great masters of Western philosophy. Ancient Greece is the home of three of the greatest philosophers of the Western world. So, as such, we need to provide a brief background of its historical reality at the time when these philosophers lived. They lived around the 5th and the 4th centuries BC. Ancient Greece was a small and harsh land with rough mountainous terrain. It was divided into a number of independent city-states, each with its own government and army. Most famous among these city-states were Athens and Sparta. These two often were at war with each other, and the stories of their wars were immortalized by poets. For example, Homer's Iliad is a famous example of the documentation of the wars between Athens and Sparta. Due to the rough terrain between the Greek city-states, travel by sea was the easiest way to travel, so we can consider them to be a seafaring nation with ships that crossed the Mediterranean. Athens and Sparta, as two of the most famous of the city-states in ancient Greece, they are often compared and contrasted with each other. Athens was a place of civilization, famous for architecture, music, literature, and philosophy. It was a democracy ruled by a democratic assembly of free citizens. Its population was divided into free citizens and a multitude of slaves who were not allowed to share in ruling the country. On the other hand, Sparta is usually considered to be the opposite of Athens. It was a harsh military state that forced everybody, even children, to undergo severe military training. It did not value literature or music or philosophy. Art had no significance for the military-minded Spartans. Like Athens, most of the economic life, such as agriculture and trade, was carried on by slaves, while free Spartans were trained exclusively for war. The people of ancient Greece were pagan. They worshipped a multitude of gods and built temples and oracles for their gods. Readers of Greek mythology are familiar with these gods, such as Zeus or Jupiter, the greatest of these gods, Mars, the god of war, Venus, the goddess of beauty, and Mercury, the messenger of the gods. So these are just a few examples of the multitude of gods who were worshipped by the citizens of ancient Greece. Greek gods were almost human in their attributes. They had love stories and jealousy and rivalry among them. There was sometimes hatred, and other emotions, so that Greek dramatists, for example Aeschylus and Sophocles, always inserted gods as characters in the plots of their drama. Thus, Athens, more than 2,500 years ago, was familiar with democracy as a political system, respected art in general, and poetry, music, drama, architecture in particular, had many temples to worship its gods, and had a system of values and morals to act as a code for human relationships. However, neither Athens nor Sparta nor other Greek cities can be regarded as exemplary or utopian, given that racism and slavery were routine practices and lifestyles accepted by most citizens. The three great masters of philosophy, those who put the foundations of Western philosophy, are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and the three were from Athens. They grew up in the cultural and political environment that we just mentioned. Being men of learning and intelligence, they were bound to think about the issues that most touched their people. Questions about ethics, virtue, and vice, questions about knowledge, and what and how do humans accomplish wisdom, questions about art and its importance to society, questions about politics and the rights and duties of citizens and rulers, and above all, questions about being, about the universe we live in. All these questions play an important role in the teachings and writings of the three great masters as they came to be known. Each of the three left a big legacy of philosophical arguments and ideas. Also, each of them worked in more than one field of philosophy, such as epistemology, ontology, ethics, aesthetics, and political philosophy. In the following pages, we will present a quick review of part of the contribution of each. And of course, our review is far from comprehensive. We would need a much longer time to give a comprehensive exposition of all their work, but actually, we are choosing a few items from each of the three great masters because we need to be acquainted with their work as a basis for our course of history of Western thought. We always mention the names of the three masters in chronological order. Socrates was the teacher and the friend of Plato, and then Aristotle came after them as the student of Plato. The early years of Socrates were spent during what may be called the Golden Age of Athens. The city-state of Athens at the time of the youth of Socrates was at the height of its cultural, economic, and political flourishing. Socrates left us no written texts. All his teachings were oral, and some of these teachings were later written down by his student Plato in the book entitled The Dialogues, where one of the characters in the book is given the name of Socrates, and this character delivers important philosophical arguments in his lines of dialogue. Also, there is a second source for the philosophy of Socrates, and this second source is the writer Xenophon, who was a conservative man anxious to clear the reputation of Socrates from the charges held against him by the Athenian government. These charges were to the effect that the teachings of Socrates have a corrupting influence on the youth of Athens. But most Athenian intellectuals, including Plato and Xenophon, rejected these charges and considered them to be politically motivated. So towards the end of his life, Socrates was put on trial because he exposed the weak points of the Athenian government and criticized the ruling party. In today's parlance, we can consider him to have been part of the opposition against the government, or to have been a political activist in a sense. So he was arrested and put on trial, and the charges were politically motivated, as we mentioned. Of course, Socrates defended himself and called these accusations evil rumors, but the judges found him guilty and he was executed. It is very interesting to know that Socrates had a chance to ask forgiveness, but he refused, and he said that he was innocent but ready to face death, because death either means annihilation or going to a better place, and in both cases he wasn't afraid to face death. Now, this trial and the execution of Socrates at the end of the trial left a strong mark on Plato and framed much of Plato's political philosophy. We have to remember that Plato was the loyal student of Socrates, and that he used Socrates as one of the major characters in his book, The Dialogues, and he documented for us many of the teachings of Socrates, who himself has left no written record, as we mentioned. But the fact that, although Athens was supposed to be a democracy, yet the government was so intolerant of the political opposition directed against it by Socrates, to the extent that they judged him and by false accusations they charged him and executed him, this event of the trial and the execution shaped Plato's political philosophy, especially in his book, The Republic. This book was like an attack on democracy. Plato, in the book, expressed lack of trust or lack of belief in the value of democracy as practiced by the Athenian society, and he offered an alternative view for the political relations between government and people. But we will not be getting into details of Plato's Republic in this context. Now that we have discussed the most important events of Socrates' life, let us focus on his major contribution to philosophy. It was mainly in the field of ethics. According to Socrates, virtue was the supreme good. Virtue was the most important goal for humans to try to attain. And Socrates believed that virtue is a result of knowledge. If you are knowledgeable, you will be able to choose the correct path and you will avoid committing mistakes, whereas ignorance always led to wrongdoing. Socrates believed that logic and rational thinking are very important to guide us, to guide humans, to the correct action. And when he was giving his teachings on ethics, he was always very careful to give precise definitions of the concepts of virtue, vice, good, just, true, beautiful. Socrates was a great believer in the importance of clear definition. The clarity of definition was of paramount value to him, and he always taught his students to avoid ambiguity of meaning. Actually, today's students, whether you are undergraduates or postgraduates, you are always required to be very clear when you are presenting your work. For example, when you are writing an essay, ambiguity of meaning is to be avoided at all costs, and one needs to be very clear and to provide clear definitions of whatever concepts one is using when doing one's academic work. And you can thank Socrates for this, for the absolute requirement of clarity of definitions, especially in academic writing. One must be very clear and precise, and one must follow a logical sequence in one's argument, and this is part of the Socratic legacy. Another major contribution by Socrates is the dialectic method, which is the method of trying to reach the truth by questions and answers. Socrates would often engage his students in discussions in order to help them discover the correct answers to philosophical questions. He would be walking with them, and sometimes they would be sitting in the open air under a tree, and then he would start a topic for the lesson of the day, and he would begin asking them what they thought about this topic. And through this method of dialogue or questions and answers, he would help them to reach accurate answers or correct answers to philosophical questions. And this dialectic method is one of the main methodological approaches adopted by researchers of philosophy and of the humanities in general up till our present time. Now, having finished the very, very brief introduction to Socrates and how he contributed to the substance or the content of philosophy, especially in the field of ethics, and also to the methodology of philosophy by suggesting and adopting the dialectic method, we can now move to the loyal student of Socrates, to Plato, who has left us a number of books. Actually, we mentioned already one of the books, The Republic, which is a book of political philosophy. And let us now see Plato's contribution to philosophy. In addition to political thought, he also contributed to the areas of metaphysics and epistemology. So let us see a selection of Plato's thought. The topic of change and permanence comes first. The allegory of the cave is second. Plato's theory of ideas or theory of forms is the third topic that we will discuss. Let us begin by change and permanence. Thinking about the world we live in, Plato was very much interested in the search for something permanent and eternal, something that permits things to be known in themselves as they really are. Because all around, Plato saw change and flux, and he wanted to know, is there something permanent and eternal? This question of change and permanence has preoccupied other Greek philosophers who came before Plato, which means he was not the first philosopher to study change and permanence. For example, the philosopher Heraclitus saw that everything was in a state of change. And there is a famous saying by Heraclitus when he said, "You cannot step into the same river twice." Of course, he meant that as a body of running water, if you try to step into a river and then after a few moments or a minute or so you want to step again, it will not be the same river because already the water has changed and the current has been moving. Heraclitus believed that the only thing in the universe that was permanent is the ever-living fire, and of course, to Heraclitus, the ever-living fire is not like an ordinary fire. If we are like in the forest and we want to light a fire in order to cook some food or in order to get warm, he meant the ever-living fire as a symbol for the source of everything in our universe. So he was calling this eternal or permanent source of the entities of the universe the ever-living fire, and he believed it to be the only permanent thing. Everything else was in continuous change or flux. Another philosopher who came also before Plato is Parmenides, and he was interested in studying this question of change and permanence, and we can consider that Parmenides had the opposite argument to Heraclitus. According to Parmenides, everything in the world was permanent. Everything. And if we think that we are seeing change around us, this is just because our senses are deceiving us. Parmenides believed that everything in the world is part of a permanent whole, and he called this permanent whole the One. Nothing ever goes away. For example, past, present, and future coexist. If we imagine that the past has already gone away and disappeared, no. It is just not visible to us any longer, but it is still there. And the present that we are living in, of course, is there. And even the future, which hasn't come yet, is there somewhere. And the fact that we cannot perceive it is just because our senses are not able to do this, but everything is always part of the unity that he called the One. Whatever we can think about must exist. If you can remember the past, the fact that you can remember it, it means that it exists, even if you no longer see it or live in it. He has a famous example to explain his point of view. The example of a young boy who fell and had a wound in his knee. When the wound heals, it will leave a scar. The boy grows up to become a man. The body of the man is bigger than that of the boy, and maybe his face has changed and his voice has changed, and even his personality may change, but the scar is still there. And this is evidence that means that nothing goes away. The past remains in the present, everything is permanent, and change is just an illusion. Now that we have discussed the points of view of Heraclitus and Parmenides about change and permanence, let us go back to Plato. And actually, Plato, like Parmenides, believes that reality is eternal and timeless, while change is an illusion, which means that if anything appears to be changing, then this is just appearance, or this is just illusion. It is not the reality, because reality is eternal, and reality is timeless. And this belief will affect Plato's further contributions, as we shall see. Plato used the form of the allegory. An allegory is a symbolic story, and he has a very famous allegory called the allegory of the cave, in order to explain to the people what he means when he says that reality is eternal and change is just an illusion, or when he, in other words, discusses appearance versus reality, which, by the way, is a very important theme in works of literature. If you are a student of literature, many of the novels or plays or poems that you study may have this theme of appearance versus reality, which is one of the philosophical themes that have been studied by many philosophers, including Plato. So, Plato used the allegory of the cave, a symbolic story, to explain the concept of appearance and reality in the world we live in. He imagined our world to be a cave, and he imagined that all the people are inside this cave or world. Plato said that the people are looking at the back wall of the cave, and they are turning their backs to the small opening at the front of the cave. They keep looking at the back wall, and they see shadows moving across this wall. They believe that these shadows are reality. However, the truth is the shadows are just distorted images of the realities that exist in the sunshine outside the cave. If somebody says, so why don't these cave dwellers or these people of the cave or the human race, why don't they think of going outside through the opening of the cave, going to the wide world and in the sunshine and seeing things for themselves as they really are? And Plato replies that they are simply afraid to go into the sunshine outside the cave. They don't know if there is any danger there or if anything will happen to them. So only a very, very few people, the philosophers or sometimes the prophets, they are the only ones who have the courage to go outside in the sunshine and to discover reality for themselves. The others, they keep huddled together inside the cave, looking at the back wall, seeing shadows, imagining the shadows to be reality, and afraid to go and search for reality outside. These philosophers or prophets, they actually want to guide the people, so they may return and try to tell them, what you are seeing is not reality, it is just appearance. We will tell you about reality. We invite you to come with us and to see reality for yourselves. But the majority of the human race across the ages is not able to do this. Some of them believe the philosophers or the prophets, and others prefer to believe in appearance, not in reality. Now, the third point that we will talk about, again, it is related to this theme of change and permanence or appearance and reality, but this time Plato is going to use this point and explain it in the form of a theory rather than an allegory. And it will be called the theory of ideas or the theory of forms. The word idea or the word form is always written with a capital at the beginning, capital I and capital F. This theory states that everything in the universe should be divided into general or absolute on the one hand and particular or specific on the other hand. Plato claims that the general or the absolute entities, they constitute reality, whereas the particular specific entities are mere appearance. Therefore, the general absolute entities that are reality, they are the ones that are permanent or eternal, whereas the particular specific ones, the ones that are just appearance, they are always in a state of change and they are just temporary. They go away. Plato called the eternal entities, the entities that constitute or that belong to the reality of the universe, he called them forms with a capital F or ideas with a capital I. And he considered that these are the only reality. Everything else is an illusion, mere appearance. For example, if you look at a beautiful object, or if you look at a good action or a just action, all these things, they are just specific particulars. They can go away, they are temporary, they are not eternal. And they are appearance, they are not reality. Whereas, if instead of the beautiful objects, you are thinking about absolute beauty, and instead of good things, you are thinking of absolute goodness. Instead of just actions, you think of absolute justice. These would be permanent, real. These would be ideas, the idea of beauty, the idea of justice, the idea of goodness, or the form. The word idea is a synonym of the word form when it comes to Plato's theory. So, philosophers seek truth which is present in the eternal, real ideas or forms. They do not care about particular or specific things. For example, if you are a philosopher, you wouldn't care about a particular action, that this is a good action or this is a bad action. You would be interested in examining the idea of goodness or the idea of badness. You wouldn't care about particular tables or dogs or nation states. You would be studying the idea of goodness or the eternal form of table or dog or state. So you will notice that Plato's theory of ideas or forms and Plato's allegory of the cave, they are all part of his metaphysical investigation, and they are all part of this examination of change and permanence. To sum up, Plato's concern for knowledge of what is true and eternal led him to propose the allegory of the cave and the theory of forms or ideas to suggest that there is a real world beyond the world of appearance that we perceive by our senses. This real world beyond is accessible to the mind of the few. As we mentioned, it is not accessible to the greatest majority of human beings. Now we come to the third of the great masters, Aristotle. Aristotle was Plato's student. He studied at Plato's Academy in Athens. And although he was influenced by his mentor, Plato, and he greatly respected his thought, he did not always accept all the arguments made by Plato. Aristotle's personal life had some interesting high points. Chief among these points is the fact that he was the private tutor of Alexander the Great for a period of 4 years, as it was believed at the time that great rulers had to be philosophers in order to rule their countries wisely. And also, among Aristotle's contributions is the essay form that we follow till the present day, when we write an essay and divide it into an introduction and a body, usually of 3 paragraphs or sections, and a conclusion. Aristotle is the one who invented this essay form. You can thank him for it. Aristotle, in addition to being a great philosopher, was also famous for his skills of observation and description, skills that some may consider to be more relevant to empirical sciences, such as physics, biology, and chemistry, rather than the humanities. However, very briefly, we will talk about some of his philosophical concepts or terminology that he contributed to the field of philosophy. The first would be universals and substances. Actually, Aristotelian universals and Aristotelian substances are like Plato's theory of forms, but instead of talking about ideas or forms or so on, Aristotle divided entities of the universe into the category of universals and the category of substances. And according to him, universals indicate common nouns. If you talk about the color black or the color white, or the taste which is sweet, sweet taste or bitter taste, or the genre of dog or chair or so on, if you talk about these as a common noun, dog, chair, black, white, sweet, bitter, then you are talking about universals, which are real, eternal entities. But if you talk about substances, then you are referring to proper nouns or particular things. For example, you talk about Shakespeare or Taj Mahal or whatever. This is a substance, not a universal. And thus, it is not eternal, it is changing, and it is not real. It is just an illusion. It does not belong to the real world. The second term used by Aristotle is the term essence. We use this term a lot when we talk about the essence of something. The essence of an item or the essence of an event is the nature of this item or the nature of this event. It is the core of the item or the event. For example, if this item loses its essence, then it will stop or cease being itself. The third term that we will mention when we talk about Aristotle is the soul. According to Aristotle, the soul is the essence of the body. Our souls are immortal, and this immortality of the souls is not an individual immortality. It doesn't mean that we are immortal. Of course, human beings die, but the soul is immortal in the sense that it is part of God's immortality. When somebody dies, their soul joins God's immortality, and this Aristotelian idea about the soul resonated later on with Christian theology, and that is why the Christian philosophers of the Middle Ages will accept Aristotle and will be influenced by his philosophy, as we shall discuss later when we talk in another chapter about Thomas Aquinas. Aristotle also made a very important contribution to the field of ethics. He has a theory of ethics called the theory of the golden mean. He based his theory of ethics on happiness. We ought to behave in order to achieve happiness, according to Aristotle. If you want to be happy, then you must have virtue, you must behave yourself. For Aristotle, we can achieve this by following the rule of the golden mean. The golden mean is a comfortable balance between two extremes. For example, courage would be the mean between cowardice and rashness. And another example, the virtue of generosity is the mean between the vices of prodigality and miserliness. So it's a very simple theory that you need to follow the golden mean in order to have virtue, and if you have virtue, then you will achieve happiness. Thus, virtue, Aristotelian virtue, means balanced behavior, whereas vice is extreme behavior. Aristotelian ethics is considered teleological. Teleological means that it is directed towards achieving a certain goal, which in this case is the goal of happiness. He doesn't say that we have to possess virtue for the sake of virtue. No, he tries to motivate people by telling them that virtue will lead you to happiness, so it is a teleological theory. Other philosophers found fault with this. They argued that one's actions have to be just and good in themselves. It is not enough to have an action which is balanced between two extremes. It has to be just and good in itself without even comparing it to other extremes. And also, the philosophers proposed that there has to be a right intention in order to fulfill the criterion of virtue. In order to be virtuous, I need to have a good intention. Maybe I will do a certain action and then by chance it will lead to good consequences. Many philosophers would not consider this to be virtue. So Aristotelian ethics is like a simplified way of inducing people to behave in order to achieve happiness, but this theory has found criticism with a number of philosophers. Having mentioned Aristotle, now we come to a final note, which is that the three great philosophers we discussed lived, as we said, about 4 or 5 centuries before Christianity. With the arrival of Christianity, the early Christian fathers had some doubts about the suitability of studying the teachings of pagan philosophers, and much of the work of these great masters and other philosophers was ignored during the first centuries after the beginning of Christianity. And there was a difference between the acceptance of the thought of Plato and the acceptance of the thought of Aristotle by the early Christian fathers. In the first centuries after Christianity, Plato was more accepted than Aristotle because his theory of forms or ideas, the fact that he made a distinction between the world of the senses and the world of the forms, appearance and reality, this was considered to be corresponding to the Christian worldview. However, the early Christian fathers were uncomfortable with Aristotelian ethics, the theory of the golden mean that we just mentioned. The church would not accept that virtue is a balance between two extremes. According to the church, virtue was basically having caritas, or love of God. And they considered Aristotelian philosophy in general and his ethics in particular to be too materialistic. That is why they ignored it. It was actually through the work of the Arab Muslim philosophers during the 10th and the 11th centuries AD. Great Muslim philosophers such as Ibn Sina, known as Avicenna, and Ibn Rushd, known also as Averroes, they studied Greek philosophy, especially Plato and Aristotle, and they added their own contributions. So this resulted in renewed interest to be awakened in Aristotelian philosophy by the fathers of the medieval Christian church. They started thinking that maybe they had wronged Aristotle by ignoring him and considering him unfit for Christian scientists to study or read or teach. And Aristotle was just becoming a strong influence around the time of Thomas Aquinas, the medieval Christian philosopher that we will discuss in a later video. Thanks a lot and good luck.